is Soviet battleship Jean Palmer, the ex-Petropavlovsk in future Petropavlovsk, start her life off as a member of the Gangut-class battleships. Marat saw service throughout the First World War and interwar years, where she saw extensive refits, some better than others, and was heavily damaged in the Second World War. After she was heavily damaged, essentially being split in two and settling in 11 meters of water, she was raised and performed excellently as a floating battery. In today's video, however, we're going to look at her refits and some proposed work after the Second World War that was just so weird that I felt I needed to make a video on it. Anyway, Marat didn't start off life refit with that name. Instead, she was originally the Petropavlovsk, part of the 4-ship Gangut-class, built for the Imperial Russian Navy in the Baltic. As we're not going to get into the development of the Gangut-class, suffice it to say, with their 12 305mm guns and 4 triple turrets, a displacement of around 25,000 tons, and a top speed close to 24 knots. Although they had excellent guns, they had relatively thin armor and weren't the best battleships. The battleships were originally designed to be competitive with second-generation dreadnoughts, while by the time they were being built and completed, the rest of the world had moved on to the second generation of super dreadnoughts. All of that being said, the ships were a very large leap for Russian shipbuilding. For example, they represented a far larger leap than the Lord Nelson to dreadnought in the Royal Navy, as the last Russian class built was the Andrei Prevozhny class built in 1904. However, during the Great War and the subsequent Russian Civil War, they didn't do a whole lot, at least in terms of engaging other ships, to take from Stephen McLaughlin in Russian and Soviet battleships. As the Soviet state slowly recovered from the devastation of the Civil War in the 1920s, the Sevastopol-class dreadnoughts were brought back into service one by one, with one exception, the fire-damaged Pava. All the ships had suffered to one degree or another from neglect in the first years of the Bolshevik regime. The lack of fuel for heating proved especially serious, as it meant that the water in the pipes froze during the harsh Baltic winters, leading to leaks and bursts during the 1920s. The ships re-entered service with minor modifications. First back in commission was the Marat ex-Petropavlovsk. She rejoined the Baltic Fleet in 1922, and according to warships of the Soviet fleet, 1939 to 1945, she was in the best condition out of all the class. She was little changed from her wartime appearance, although she now had 6 76.2mm anti-aircraft guns, probably Lender model 1914 to 1915, 3 each on a first and fourth turrets. A new superstructure was added on top of the forward conning tower, displacing the rangefinder, which was shifted to a platform on the foremast just below the level of the top funnel. Now, Morrill would write out most of the 1920s with these changes, but the ship and her sisters were going to need some serious work if they wanted to continue having them in service with the Red Fleet. In 1925, talks about more extensive modernizations to the ships came during the drafting of the 1926 construction program. But nothing was done immediately. 2 years later, a committee headed by the Navy's Technical Administration considered modernization an urgent necessity. The fears of the committee boiled down to the ship's inadequacies of their 305mm guns, armor, engine plant, and well, almost everything about the ships really. They were old and poorly taken care of. The committee figured that to do a complete overhaul and modernization of the ships was going to cost around 40 million rubles per ship, and with trying to establish the Soviet state, famine, and other such problems, finding the money for the Navy was going to be a bit of a struggle. So members of the Scientific Technical Committee worked out minimal and maximum conversion plans. The most serious problem faced by naval architects was the lack of blast-free above-deck space. The linear arrangements of the main battery turrets and their requisite fields of fire consumed almost all the weather deck area. Unlike most foreign ships, there was no mid-ship section free from blast that could be utilized for anti-aircraft guns, aircraft facilities, or the like. Under the circumstances, the Soviet designers came up with the following. Again, taking from McLaughlin, increase the armor protection of the middle deck from 25mm to 76mm, convert the boilers to oil firing, increase boiler performance allowing for the removal of 3 boilers in the forward fire room, remove cruising turbines, install chemical protection, remove a 120mm battery and install stronger AA battery of 100mm and 40mm guns. Install a tripod mast supporting a command rangefinder post, as well as improve gun laying mechanism. Alter forward funnel to keep new bridges clear of smoke. Install anti-torpedo bulges. Improve seeping by alterations to the bow. Install a catapult and 1 or 2 new seaplanes for reconnaissance and spotting. This was dubbed the Big Modernization and would cost more than 20 million rubles per ship, which was well beyond the economic means of the Navy. So it was decided to go with a small modernization, of which the Paris Commune, I can't do the Russian version, was the first to undergo these in the late 1920s, having her superstructure, funnels, bow, and other parts of the ship altered, where she was made ready to go take post as the flagship for the Black Sea Fleet, being seriously damaged in the Bay of Bisque, rolling up to 38 degrees in the storm. Next up for modernization was Marat. Taking from Laughlin again, the Mora was the next ship to be taken in hand for modernization, and a more ambitious reconstruction was carried out. She was followed in turn by October Revolution and once again Paris Commune. Each reconstruction was based on the one before. The ship was brought to the Baltic Works for modernization in 1928. The work lasted 2.5 years, the ship re-entering service with the Baltic Fleet on April 8, 1931. The most obvious change in a reconstruction was the elaboration of the forward superstructure, which was required for the new fire control gear. At the top of the tubular tower, foremast 33.5 meters above the waterline, was the KDP-6 command rangefinder post. This featured 2 6-meter Zeiss rangefinders, this being somewhat similar to the British DCT. Other platforms around the foremast and conning tower supported the control equipment for the secondary battery and search lights. The limited space available meant that the new superstructure was relatively cramped and very close to the forward funnel. So following the Paris Commune's earlier refit, the funnel was raised 2 meters and angled back. The after superstructure was somewhat modified, but nothing to the degree of the forward part. The Soviets did order seaplanes from Germany, being carried atop the 3rd turret. However, as there was no domestically produced catapult yet available, the aircraft would be launched and recovered from the water. The aircraft were rarely carried or used. The main guns were given a modest overhaul. The 305mm guns were replaced along with the machinery and electrical equipment. The secondary battery was unchanged, but more anti-aircraft guns were added as well, these being maximum machine guns and 76.2mm guns. Machinery was also improved with the addition of oil-firing Euro boilers. The greater steam productivity of oil firing made it possible to remove 3 boilers from the forward fire room, the space vacated being used for anti-aircraft ammunition stowage and other posts like damage control center, radio room, and even a hydrophone room. The changes also made it possible to make the ship more watertight, sealing hatches and doors for moving coal. The cruising turbines were also removed, which simplified the engine plant. Other alterations to the ship were made, especially in light of the Paris Commune's experience in the Bay of Bisque, but Marat was not fit with anti-torpedo bulges, eventually completing her transformation in 1931, where you might be asking yourself, all these changes seem pretty good. How could this go poorly? Well, it just will. We'll have to wait and see though. McLaughlin writes, the Transformer Raw underwent trials in 1931, at which time her metacentric height was 1.93 meters, at her full load displacement of 25,890 tons compared to the original design's 1.76 meters. The fact that her initial stability increased as a result of her modernization was probably because her fuel was now oil scored in the double bottom rather than coal in the side bunkers up in the ship. However, an unhappy discovery was made during these trials. At some speeds, the tubular mass began to vibrate, interfering with effective fire control. Increasing its rigidity would have required substantial reconstruction. So shock absorbers were fitted to the optical instruments to minimize vibrations. Various minor modifications were made to the ship throughout the coming years, Still, by the 1940s, it was clear that Marat's modernization was not satisfactory, especially compared to the October Revolution. So, another reconstruction was planned, and hopefully find a way for the mast and superstructure to not vibrate so violently. Still, it would never come to fruition due to the Second World War, being sunk in September 1941, and was never fully repaired. The conversion wasn't an outright terrible idea. Certainly improvements on our condition beforehand. But that vibration was a serious problem and made using the new equipment difficult, coupled with the fact that the Gangut-class weren't the best battleships, and by the 1940s, very old, it culminated in a bad situation for the battleship. Now, I think it's appropriate to discuss her service in a limited sense in that sinking, as it's critical to understand the future World War II damage proposals. Marat and the October Revolution were stationed in the Baltic and participated to a limited extent in the Winter War, struggling to get involved due to the Finnish coastal batteries. But when the Finns had issue with their coastal batteries, the battleships could get to work with Marat on December 19th, 1939, firing 133 rounds of high explosives near Vorborg, with her gunnery actually being quite good, destroying buildings and knocking down trees that concealed the Finnish. Guns! The Finns thought they had gotten a hit when the guns were working, but Russian publications made no mention of such a hit. But in any case, the Finnish guns were closing the range, so she got out of there. Subsequently, the battleships left the area and made their way back to the Baltic base at Tallinn. With the Germans massing on the Soviet border, Soviet naval forces were taking measures to prepare where to take from McLaughlin. Soviet plans called for the 2 battleships plus 2 Leningrad-class destroyer leaders and 20 destroyers to operate behind the mine barrier at the entrance to the Gulf of Finland, while 2 Kirovov-class cruisers and 2 flotillas of destroyers would defend the Gulf of Riga. On June 20th, 1941, Marat returned to Crunchod, but October Revolution remained at Tallinn. Within days of the German invasion on June 22nd, Soviet defenses were crumbling, and with the rapid German advance having taken Riga so quickly, it was clear that Tallinn would soon be besieged and the October Revolution was withdrawn. Due to that rapid advance, soon enough Axis forces were getting close to Leningrad and had effectively immobilized the 2 battleships of the Baltic Fleet with minefields laid in the first 6 months of the war. Some 21,000 mines were laid in the Baltic and in particular the Gulf of Finland, which some historians have described the sea being polluted with mines. Not only that, operations were limited due to the lack of fuel in the city as the Germans tightened their siege. Both ships suffered damage from German field guns, but nothing that caused serious damage until September 23, 1941, when Marat was attacked by waves of dive bombers and was hit by 2 1,000-kilogram bombs, or for us who use imperial units, 2,200 pounds almost simultaneously. Both bombs struck in the vicinity of the forward superstructure. Immediately following was the detonation of the forward magazines. The turret was heaved up as well. The conning tower and forward funnel were blown over to starboard. 326 men were killed, including the captain and executive officer, and the forward part of the hull was from frames 20 to 57 demolished. The after part of the ship was still left afloat. However, progressive flooding caused the ship to settle in 11 meters of water. The ship was raised and returned to service as a floating battery, an impressive feat considering the damage. She continued to take damage but suffered nothing major after that. On May 31, 1943, she was given back her original name and continued to operate as a floating battery until the end of the siege of Leningrad. By the time the siege had been lifted in January 1944, she had fired an impressive 1,971 305mm shells. At around this point, talks were beginning about her reconstruction, considering the extensive damage to the ship. Frankenstein time. Some context to the refit of Petropavlovsk in the Second World War, as some of you like to point out. Yes, I see your comments. The battleship was on its way out. But as the Soviets, and especially the Americans showed, older ships with heavy artillery could still play an important role in providing gunfire support to military targets and coastal areas, either to defend an area or for an amphibious assault. They were also useful as training vessels due to their size. Postwar, the Soviets possessed two working battleships, the October Revolution in the Baltic and the Sevastopol in the Black Sea, with special consideration being given to the Petropavlovsk to refit her with the damage in mind. That, of course, being the explosion in the forward main battery magazine. The first ideas of such a thing were happening in 1943, where it was proposed that the forward section of the front X-Pava would be used to replace the damaged bow of the Petropavlovsk. A simple enough idea. In addition to the new bow, the third turret was to be moved to replace the destroyed forward turret in the space of midships thereby gained was to be used for 130mm guns and other anti-aircraft guns. An excellent idea considering what we had discussed previously about the lack of space for such weapons on the ship. Deck armor was going to be reinforced and bulges added, bringing the ship to a new displacement of 30,000 tons. This idea never really went anywhere beyond drawing boards, though. Taking from McLaughlin, a similar plan was proposed toward the end of the war when TSKB-17, the design bureau in charge of large surface ships, was directed by the Navy Commissariat to work out a plan for restoring the Petropavlovsk to a reasonable operational condition. Once again, the destroyed forward section of the hull would be replaced with a part of the intact hull from the prunes. In response to the assignment, TSKB-17 came up with what might be described as a minimal reconstruction of the ship. Less ambitious than the 1943 plan, with the prunes bow grafted on the forward section of the ship, the Petropavlovsk's operational third turret would be moved to the number 1 position. The deck space vacated between the funnel and the after superstructure would provide room for a powerful battery of 130mm guns. Elaborate superstructures would be erected fore and aft, reflecting the increasing importance of fire control and communal facilities. The tall tower mast shows a director that looks similar to the KDP-8 directors intended for the Sovietsky Soyuz and Kronstadt classes. The original secondary battery would be eliminated and casemates plated over. The new battery would be 16 130mm guns and twin turrets, where the third turret was originally mounted as seen in this graphic. It's not clear if these were the older 50 caliber guns or the newer 58 caliber guns, or if they were dual purpose or not, along with a new smattering of smaller anti-aircraft guns. The armor protection was relatively unchanged from the original arrangements, with the conning tower being increased to 195mm and the turret roofs being increased before the war to 150mm. Unlike the 1943 plan, the ship's weak horizontal protection was to not be improved, nor were anti-torpedo bulges to be fitted. As for machinery, it isn't very clear. The original publication says the boilers were to be reduced from 20 to 16, and whether these were to be new, more powerful boilers is unclear, although it is likely they would be considering. When the ship was damaged, she lost most of her forward boilers. The available drawing shows only one large funnel, so the machinery spaces would have been moved around to accommodate this new conclusion design. The ship was certainly going to be interesting in this configuration, certainly not a match for anything on the high seas at the moment, like the Iowa-class, Vanguard, or any of the remaining battleships, except maybe the Huliotzer, the future Novorossiysk. Link in the description. Anyway, McLaughlin writes, the end result of this reconstruction would not have been a battleship in the traditional meaning of the word, a ship designed to fight her counterparts on the high seas. Instead, she would have been a fairly competent, if weakly protected, gunfire support ship. Nevertheless, on October 31, 1946, Admiral Kuznetsov recommended that the reconstruction of the Petropavlovsk be cancelled. No further work was done on the Project 27 design, although the formal cancellation did not come until June 29, 1938. On November 28, 1950, the Petropavlovsk was renamed Volkov and used as a school ship until she was finally stricken on September 4, 1953, and subsequently broken up. There you have it, folks, some rather interesting refits, proposed refits, and part of a career of the Petropavlovsk. Noun, the final proposal. Although interesting, probably wasn't the best idea considering the way the world was going, being an easy target for aircraft in the Baltic. Nevertheless, an interesting bit of history. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please remember to like and subscribe, as it'll help the channel to grow. And until next time, my friends, have a great week.